For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi. In our special series, 1 year on from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, our special expert analyst is from London. He will be joining us, Brigadier Ben Barry from IISS. Joining us from London the first time on our platform is Brigadier Ben Barry. Brigadier Barry, great to see you on StratNews Global, and thank you so much for your time.
Well, happy to be able to help.
Brigadier Barry, just looking at developments in the last 24 hours or so, Biden's visit to Kyiv, meeting with President Zelenskyy. Soon after that, the postponed annual State of the Nation address Putin gave over 2 hours. President Biden will be speaking in Poland as well. How do you see this strategic messaging from the top levels? I mean, when you look at President Biden, for example, some would see it as a rebuke to President Putin's goals, a symbol, actually, some would say, of Russian failure, or others would say that it's a validation of what the Kremlin's point of view is, that this is actually a US versus a Russia war with Ukraine as a proxy.
Well, we need to see this war as having a battle of contrasting narratives. And, Ukraine and Russia are engaged in this indirectly, but Ukraine's friends and allies are also engaged in this. I mean, you couldn't have got a much stronger statement of support to Ukraine than a visit as the president to Kyiv, in which his messaging was that the US supports Ukraine, wants to continue delivering weapons and also providing financial support, and that the US is with Ukraine for the long haul. I think what I've seen of Putin's speech today is Putin saying also that Russia's in it for the long haul, that we're not backing down, that actually we're going to continue, we're going to be putting increasing effort into supporting soldiers and the families of those who are killed, and really doubling down on the war. So there isn't much common ground between Ukraine, the US and Ukraine's allies, and Russia. In fact, there's no common ground at all right now.
Sure. I just wanted to go to the IISS Military Balance 2023 report that you released just last week. Can you share with us, Brigadier Barry, your assessment of the war 1 year on in terms of what's largely looked at as a strategic stalemate and the broad reasons for that stalemate?
Okay, well, it is currently at stalemate. It's not necessarily going to remain at stalemate, but the Russian attack was intended to quickly overthrow the Ukrainian government, and the campaign was based on inadequate intelligence and excessive optimism. But the Ukraine leaders stayed at their posts, the armed forces didn't collapse. And then you got very poor conduct of their offensive campaign by the Russian forces, and external support by Ukraine's allies has entangled Moscow in an extended campaign, much longer than they hoped for. It's also the case that successful counteroffensives by the Ukraine forces have evicted Russia from about half the territory they conquered at their high water mark, say at the latter stages of March.
Sure. If I can go into specific armaments next and the report. Yeah. But again, before that, give us the larger picture of Russia and Ukraine in terms of inventories, whether it's firepower or whether it's human power. 1 year on, there have been clearly losses on both sides. How are stocks when it comes to equipment, production, or third country supplies?
Well, the first thing is that there's a lot of important known unknowns. I mean, both sides are not going to give us an inventory of their stocks. And they're also not providing much public information about casualties. And indeed, in the case of Ukrainian casualties, international journalists have found it impossible to get admission to Ukrainian military hospitals. But to start off with, hundreds of thousands of people have been killed. I mean, this has been a terrible war. I've seen enough of war myself, particularly in Bosnia, to know that's the case, and the human suffering has been quite considerable. Now, in terms of people who could be mobilized, military veterans with military experience, and indeed people who become eligible for conscription by virtue of their age, Russia quite clearly has larger reserves than Ukraine. But whether Russia's got the ability to properly mobilize these people and properly train them, and also to fit them into capable military units, I don't think that's very clear. Before we actually go on the hardware, I think it's worth saying that Ukraine's military units appear to be better led and better trained, and to have higher morale than Russian military units. Indeed, it's not clear to me that the 300,000 or so men that Russia mobilized last autumn are going to be fed into functioning military units that have a high standard of morale and combat capability. Now, talking about numbers of equipment, we came to the view in IISS, which is broadly similar to what the US, a number of European intelligence agencies are saying, is that of Russia's fleet of modern tanks, that is T-72s, T-80s, T-90s, Russia has lost about half of them. Now, the UK Ministry of Defence says that about 90% of Russia's land forces are committed to the war in Ukraine. We think that's correct. Ukraine, though, has only a small defence industry, and quite clearly, early on in the war, it started using up ammunition at an unprecedented rate. I mean, the Russians have also been firing ammunition at an unprecedented rate, tens of thousands of shells a day in total. So Ukraine has become completely dependent on external supplies of ammunition and new equipment from its allies in the West. Russia still has a large amount of military equipment stockpiled, but a lot of that is previous generation equipment. It's equipment from the 1960s and 50s, and what sort of state it's in and how ready it is to be mobilized isn't quite clear. So I think what this is telling me is right now the war's pretty much stalemated. That's not to say there isn't fighting going on. There's heavy fighting going on. And these Russian attacks we're seeing in the Donbass are very much designed to pin the Ukrainians in place, forcing them to defend under unfavorable conditions, and hoping that the Russians can inflict a lot of casualties through artillery fire.
A question from a viewer for you, Brigadier. This is from Jaydeep Gadavi, who says, with much of the fighting concentrated in Donbass, how much different is it from the past 2014 scenario? He's referring to Crimea.
Well, 2014, the war initially had quite a mobile phase in which the Ukrainians attempted to push back the pro-Russian militias, but they themselves suffered heavy casualties when they were attacked by heavy Russian rocket artillery. Since 2014 until 22, it was a pretty static front line with static trench systems. Not necessarily a heavy level of conflict, but a persistent conflict with a steady stream of casualties on both sides. What we've got now in the Donbass is a very high level of combat in which Russia's making a lot of use of artillery ammunition and a lot of use of human wave attacks. The human wave attacks don't seem to be particularly competently conducted, and the Russian forces mounting these attacks seem to be taking heavy casualties.
Going into specifics now, as you pointed out, the IISS report says about 50% of Russian pre-invasion fleet of its modern T-72s are assessed to have been lost. Now, when we talk about the requests from other countries and how that has moved, the US promising possibly 31 of its Abrams tanks, the UK saying 14 Challenger 2, Germany 14 Leopard 2. But help us understand the time frame and the numbers. Now, this could clearly take months, if not more, and Ukraine wants hundreds of them. What are these tanks needed for in terms of defensive, counteroffensive, offensive purposes?
Okay, well, if we go back to September, the Ukrainian Chief of Defense stated publicly that in 2023, he wanted to see Ukraine forces going over to the offensive to evict Russia from the Ukrainian territory they controlled. He was very clear that to do this, Ukraine needed to build another 10 heavy armoured or mechanised brigades equipped with modern Western armoured vehicles. And since last December, Ukraine has been saying to do this, they need about 300 more tanks and about 700 more infantry fighting vehicles and about another 500 howitzers. Now, we've tracked, and sorry, Ukraine has also said these need to be modern equipments. Now, many of the declarations made by Western countries since then, quite a significant proportion of that equipment has not been modern. You know, the French AMX-10 RC is not a modern armoured vehicle. It's also got very thin armour. Similarly, the 140 Leopard 1 tanks that had been provided from a Belgian company that's basically gathers and sells second-hand armoured vehicles. That's not current top modern generation equipment either. Compared with modern tanks, Leopard 1 has pretty thin armour and it's got a lower caliber gun. Now, so what sort of modern tanks are out there? Well, there's Leopard 2 tanks, there's British Challenger tanks, and there's a US Abrams. What's actually been declared by Germany is a plan to build up 2 battalions worth of Leopard tanks. That's 80 tanks. So far, we've tracked the declarations of people who've declared that they're giving Ukraine modern tanks and are going to give them in the next few months. And as well as 14 British Challenger 2s, there's about 50 European countries that have said they'll give some Leopard 2 tanks. In terms of modern infantry fighting vehicles, there's only about 140 of those being declared. So that's enough for about 1.5 brigades and falls far short of the amount of modern armour that the Ukrainians have said they want.
So this is not a question of the West, NATO, having problems with ratcheting up, or is it a problem of the countries not having the equipment, despite NATO having what, a $1.3 trillion defense budget to give to Ukraine in terms of tanks?
Well, if we look at Leopard 2, because Leopard 2, there's about 2,300 of those held by the armies of Europe. And it's a good modern tank. It has the same gun as the American Abrams, but it's got a diesel engine. The disadvantage with the American Abrams is it's got a gas turbine engine rather than a diesel engine, which is more complicated to maintain. And also a gas turbine engine uses up twice as much fuel as a diesel engine. But the US has said they're going to provide M1 Abrams tanks, but they're not being taken out of warehouses. They're going to be specifically manufactured. So I'd be surprised if Ukraine sees any of those in less than a year. Challenger 2 is a good tank. It uses different ammunition from Leopard 2. Now, it may be that out of those 2,300 Leopard 2 tanks that are in Europe, a high proportion of them are not battle ready because of reductions in logistics and reductions in ammunition and reductions in spare parts made by European armies. But it's an inconvenient truth that to generate 300 Leopard 2 tanks from an overall holding of over 2,000, ought not to be difficult for Europe, but it seems to be that there are readiness problems. Whether the European production lines of ammunition, both armoured vehicle ammunition and artillery and rocket ammunition, are on a war footing yet isn't clear to me. For example, in UK, the only contract I've recently seen the UK government place for more materiel to replace what it's given to Ukraine and supply more to Ukraine is a contract for more NLAW anti-tank missiles. And it looks to me as if Europe's taking quite some time to place its production lines on a war footing.
Interesting point there. But also the growing Ukrainian campaign for fighter jets, for F-16s. Now, in the UK, when he was there, Prime Minister Sunak agreed to train pilots. I believe that's already started, I think. But the time frames involved, can you help us understand that, even if the West agrees to that? And also the larger question, not just for fighters, but for any kind of equipment, how does the marriage of this Western and ex-Soviet arms work, in terms of communication?
Well, that's several questions there. So let me tackle the issue about fighters, and then we'll come to the second one.
Sure.
Well, since the outset of the war, Ukrainian air defenses have proved effective in neutralizing the threat of the Russian Air Force. So Russian fighters and bombers have by and large not flown over Ukrainian territory, although they have done some bombing of the front line. And this is because Ukraine dispersed its air force and dispersed its air defenses. And they've proved very, very effective. But in the autumn, you might recall that Russia increased its firing of missiles, particularly cruise missiles, against Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. And that was all part of the campaign over the winter to inflict pain on Ukraine, particularly in terms of power supplies, of heating, because you must remember that in former Soviet countries, heating is centralized. So large housing estates, housing projects will have a centralized heating station, and also to attack the infrastructure of the railways, which have proved so vital in sustaining Ukraine's capability. Now, initially, Ukraine wasn't shooting down enough cruise missiles. It's shooting down a higher proportion now, but every time a salvo of cruise missiles is fired, some get through. And there's also this question of these loitering drones that Russia has acquired from Iran. So what Ukraine wants more jets for is to plug the gaps in the air defenses to complement the ground-based missiles and guns by fighters who can move more rapidly over the airspace above Ukraine and who can help shoot down these cruise missiles. Now, Ukraine also wants fighters so they can take the attack to Russia and do bomb and rocket attack on Russian positions. We think they've suffered some attrition, although they're not letting on how much, because the Russians are standing outside Ukraine and they're firing long-range anti-aircraft missiles to try and bring down the Ukrainian Air Force. Now, what type of aircraft is best for this isn't quite clear. I mean, the F-16 is a well-proven NATO fighter. Typhoon, which is in service with Britain, France, Italy, and a number of other countries, probably isn't very suitable. It's not optimized for low level. Its air intake is at the bottom, which makes it difficult for it to use grass strips or fly from roads or short airfields. The Swedish-made Gripen is much better in that regard, but it would take time to introduce these into Ukraine. It wouldn't take too long to teach a pilot how to fly the fighter and which buttons to press to use the weapons. But building up the skill level that they could do this effectively and survive in those hostile skies above Ukraine, that's going to take some time. It would also take more time to train up the maintenance personnel and indeed to set up a logistics supply chain that got the necessary spare parts to the aircraft on a Ukrainian airbase. And your second question was?
when this is a whole lot of equipment that's coming in from different countries, Western plus ex-Soviet equipment, how does a force marry it? Not necessarily just in terms of fighters, but in terms of communication, sensors, training. How does that work when there are different systems from
Okay.
different countries?
I mean, I think the first thing to say is whenever you introduce a new equipment to an army, or for that matter, an air force, it comes with a logistic bill, because you need to be able to provide the fuel, you need to be able to provide the ammunition, and you need to be able to provide the spare parts. And aircraft and helicopters are very intensive on spare parts. You also need to train up not just the crews, but the logisticians and the maintenance personnel to actually do the maintenance. You know, they can be advised over Zoom, but there's a limit to how much you can do that. But actually, the Ukrainians have proved very adept at incorporating new technology into their battle. And this is because I think that, you know, they're fighting for their lives, they're fighting for their country. Their morale and motivation is very high, but it builds on their existing skills. So, for example, Ukrainian artillery, you know, Ukraine has a branch of the artillery that fires rockets. When the US gifted the HIMARS rocket launcher, it was existing Ukrainian rocket artillery people who were taken to Grafenwehr, given a brief amount of training, allowed to fire some missiles, and then went back to the battle in Ukraine. I myself commanded an armoured infantry battalion that had half a dozen different types of armoured vehicles. Once you trained a soldier to be a driver of one kind of armoured vehicle, it didn't take too long to convert them to be a driver of a different armoured vehicle. You know, in my particular case, it didn't used to take more than 5 days. I mean, I qualified on a number of different armoured vehicle gunnery systems. And once you'd qualified on the first one, it was much quicker to learn how to use the others. So the training of the operators isn't necessarily too time consuming for land systems, but for aircraft and helicopters, it's going to be longer.
Understood. You mentioned HIMARS, other equipment. President Biden again announcing 30-second drawdown from U.S. Defense Department equipment. Now, how do you see that progressing in terms of continuous supply of equipment from the West, considering issues in the US or in Europe itself?
Well, I mean, it's worked pretty well so far. I mean, quite early on in the war, the UK took the initiative of forming a contact group to coordinate the supply of military equipment and ammunition to Ukraine. That was then taken over by the US. There's a large headquarters in Stuttgart, which is the headquarters of US European Command, where all the nations that are supplying military equipment to Ukraine are represented. And there's a Ukraine delegation headed up by a lieutenant general. And it's all very closely coordinated. And I think that part of it has worked well. The one thing that it seems to me is a risk at the moment is the question of whether Ukraine's allies are producing enough ammunition quickly enough to sustain the Ukrainians fighting at the tempo that the war has had so far. And I don't think we've got a clear answer on that.
Another thing that happened last week with the Secretary of State, U.S. Secretary of State Blinken at the Munich Security Conference, Wang Yi was also there. How do you see the U.S. warning to China, or at least what the U.S. said was a warning to China against providing or considering to provide lethal equipment or ammunition to Russia?
Well, I think it's pretty much as it seems. You know, it was Secretary Blinken.
No, do you think China will actually reach that stage to do that, is the question?
Sorry, I don't know. I mean, China can do it because many of their military equipments are based on Cold War Soviet era systems. So, for example, their tanks all use the same 125 millimeter main gun, and that ammunition, in theory at least, ought to be compatible with the ammunition on Ukrainian T-72 tanks. So that so whether this is based on intelligence or whether it's based on speculation, but quite clearly China has a large defense industry. It has some of the largest defense industrial companies in the world. And as it produces weapons and ammunition based on Cold War era Soviet patterns, quite clearly, if China chose to supply equipment and ammunition to Russia, Russia would welcome that. Whether China would be willing to pay the political price, the diplomatic price, and be willing also to bear possibly further US sanctions against Chinese industry. I mean, I think that's a question that's really for the US and for China.
And again, part of what the IISS report looks at, China, its modernization, how the West and other countries are looking at containing China. Now, the longer this war continues, how do you see it affecting, say, the US or the UK's Indo-Pacific strategies? I mean, can the West credibly contain two enemies, or if the need arises at some point of time, fight two wars?
Well, US defense policy and strategy has long been based on the ability to fight two wars. Yeah. The US isn't fighting in Europe, but ammunition and equipment is fighting and is being used up at the rate of a major war. But the US has not reduced any of its footprint in the Indo-Pacific, which of course there's not much footprint near India, but there's a significant footprint in the Gulf. The US Navy is active in the Indian Ocean, and the US has a large footprint in the Indo-Pacific, from Australia to the middle of Japan. Where I think the difficult question is for European countries like the UK that have said they want to do more military activity in the Indo-Pacific. But whether they've got the capability to do so now, I think is an urgent question. And there's also a policy question. NATO has declared that the most clear and present danger to the Euro-Atlantic area is Russia. Well, Russia has shown that it's prepared to throw its weight around and engage in war. What comes next, how the war in Ukraine might end, but also the extent to which Russia continues to be a threat to Europe. The European armed forces are smaller than they were. I mean, the UK armed forces are particularly small, and they can't be in two places at once.
Sure. Another one for you from viewer Kurt Cobain, Brigadier. What could possibly bring both sides to the negotiating table?
Okay, well, I was with UN forces in Bosnia in 1995 when the negotiations to end the war in Bosnia started, and they were started by the United States acting as a neutral party, but being decisively engaged earlier. And I think, why did they all come to the table? Partly because they were all exhausted by the war. Hundreds of thousands of people have been killed. The economies of the three different countries, Bosnia, Croatia, and Serbia, had been wrecked. Bosnia's case by war, Croatia and Serbia by sanctions. And I think they were weary of the war. And when the US got to be decisively engaged, they actually quite happily sat down around the conference table at Dayton. So they, by the third year of the war, by the second half of the third year of the war, they'd had enough and they were ready to engage in negotiations. I think we're far from that situation now with the war in Ukraine.
Sure. Barry, I absolutely appreciate you giving us your time and sharing both your experience and your expertise with all our viewers here on StratNews Global. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. I'm sorry I can't be more optimistic, but we are where we are.
Absolutely. Thank you again. And a message to all our viewers. If you like this video, do hit the thumbs up button on YouTube. Share the link as widely as possible. You You can follow all our social media handles, join our Telegram channel to get the latest updates that we put up on our website, or interviews like this with Brigadier Barry on our YouTube channel. And you can also help us financially. There's a descriptor in the YouTube descriptor. There's a link, I beg your pardon, in the YouTube descriptor. This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi.